So let's get everybody up to speed so we're on the same page. So what have we talked about so far in that article? What did we talk about for it on Monday?
Which article was it, sorry?
Oh, this is the Ibsen, the populist conjecture. This is the one on Habermas, the legitimation crisis, and basically like what happened in economics in 2008. How that, and the relationship between that. Remember I was talking about populism? What was populism? That's where we started at on Monday for this article. What is populism? Yeah.
It's appealing to the common man, or like, kind of just the ordinary people, I guess. Okay.
Yeah, it's a politics that revolves around an appeal to ordinary people. In contrast to what? What's the opposite of the ordinary people in a populist worldview? The elite of some kind, right? Or a variety of different elites, right? They can be economic elites, political elites, intellectual elites, et cetera, right? So within a populist narrative, there's a hostility towards elites, right? And this identification with the everyday people. Sort of a man of the people narrative. What makes people a little paranoid about populism? Why do people get nervous about populism? Why is it that, like, if you read scholarly journal articles on populism, you're not going to get a whole bunch of people praising it? Because it kind of sounds like a good idea, right? Like us being democratic, like appeal to the common people, like yeah, right? Like it kind of feels right. Why are people nervous around it?
Because it's only like a host kind of ideology for like different types. Instead of like, they're like a host ideology.
Yeah. That was the idea that it attaches itself to a host ideology. What ideologies does populism have a tendency to attach itself to?
Fascism, communism.
Yeah, so they're essentially more extreme. People have a tendency to pull to extremes when they're populist, right? And pretty much every ruler that was called fascist, like you have to be not democratic to become fascist, right? Because otherwise you're just a monarchy, right? Like you don't put one person in charge, right? So like fascism, all those governments were originally democratic, and all the movements that elected fascist leaders were populist movements, Same thing with like communist governments have a tendency to have gotten into power via populist movements. So in a weird way, this appeal to the everyday person's perspective, rather than creating more democracy, actually has a tendency to create less of that, which is a sort of strange irony, right? So like, there's a lot of people, because that's weird, right? Like there's a lot of people who want to like uncover what is it that actually makes that happen, right? Because it's a strange leap from being like, we should have direct democracy and whatever the will of the people, general will of the people, to having basically anti-democratic authoritarian regimes. Like, this is a big leap. So there's a lot of questions of how is it that happens, right? It's sort of, so this is adding to a literature on how is it that we get populist governments, how is it that this leap occurs? What's really going on behind it? And so we started to talk about their solution to it by talking about Habermas, but we haven't pulled back to that yet. So what was it that we were talking about when it came to Habermas? What is Habermas's project? Jürgen Habermas. I just like saying his full name. What was Jürgen Habermas's theory about?
Are you talking about like the legitimation crisis?
So one aspect of Habermas that we were getting into is the legitimation crisis. A legitimation crisis. before we get into the legitimation crisis itself, what was the overarching point of Habermas's work? What was he trying to do? He was trying to update something. Yeah.
Was it revamping Marxism?
Yeah. Habermas is trying to revamp, to alter Marxism to make it more useful to analyze what's going on today in politics and economics. He's a part of a larger group of people called the Frankfurt School who all did that. He's a later Frankfurt School person. And so yeah, like he's interested in what problem in particular about Marxism is he trying to address? This is that thing about contradiction.
The functional contradictions of capitalism.
Yeah, so he's interested in the functional contradictions of capitalism. What does that mean? What sort of things were we talking about? What are the contradictions embedded in capitalism?
Sorry. Basically in capitalism, as wealth is increasing, but so is inequality. So he's kind of talking about that, and then also how to remove the contradiction of overthrowing the government within Marxism.
Yeah. So yeah, basically the idea. So the overthrowing the government thing. Yeah. So one of the problems with using Marxism today is that the solution of Marxism was essentially wait around for capitalism to implode itself, and then, right, workers of the world will save us, which obviously never happened, right? So it was kind of a false dream of Marxists. Any attempt to make that happen turned into authoritarian regimes in Europe and in Asia, right? So generally speaking, that dream had been given up on, right? It didn't work out. So Habermas is so how can we use that analysis of capitalism, right, and still have it pertinent, but understand why it was that the contradictions of capitalism never led. Because the fact is it's kind of if most of your population, right, if you're bringing in massive amounts of wealth, but most of your population don't see a whole lot of benefit from that, it seems like that should create some sort of divide. And we often talk this way in general, right? If people, you'll hear, people who are very politically active say things like, if people get pushed hard enough, they'll fight back, right? But it actually, that rarely happens. And it hasn't really happened. So why is that, right? And so Habermas had a solution to why is it that people are perfectly okay, working more hours, working harder, right? Setting aside things for a system that disproportionately doesn't benefit them, right? And there's something that occurs that Habermas pulls to. Can you catch this in last class? This had to do with how we deal with basically economic depressions and things like that. We created a different governmental system. What governmental system was created in the 20th century that we talked about on Monday? Has a word that's a scare word for a lot of people in it. The welfare state, yeah. So for Habermas, the welfare state, essentially intervenes in capitalism. So latently, a lot of the things that we use and benefit us, they're things that the state provides in one way or another, or at least the state supports through infrastructure in one way or another. And if you've ever spent time in a peripheral nation, in a third world country, you're very aware of the things that your government does support. So we don't have things like constant roving blackouts because we haven't updated our electronic grid since the 70s, right? That's really annoying if you're going to spend at least 2 hours a day without any electricity. Imagine trying to write your papers if you knew the campus would just be in a blackout for 2 hours every day. but you didn't know when. It roved. So it could be at 8 o'clock, it could be at 6 o'clock, it could be at noon, right? Just all of a sudden you'd be sitting in your dorms, your lights would shut out. Anything you didn't save is gone, right? It's kind of frustrating, right? Not to say that like that's a horrible frustration or a horrible thing or the worst thing that happens in the world, right? But that basically the reason why that doesn't happen is because part of what goes into our electronic grid is that it's not a purely private organization. Private companies provide electricity for us, but they do it often being backed by some sort of public welfare system where the government pays for a lot of that, right? You could think about things like the postal service is a good example too, right? Like if we had to pay for private shipping, especially like if you, did anybody here grow up in a rural area at all? Like out in the country? A couple of you guys, like could you imagine if you had to pay somebody just to drive out to drop off a package every time, how much that would cost? Like you think about like some places, like you go out west where the people live in the next nearest town is an hour away. Like you would not be able to deliver mail to that place if it wasn't for the fact that the post office is a public-private merger. Right? So the welfare state is essentially all these things that the government does to sort of prop up capitalism and make it a little more friendly. Right? So like the welfare state is essentially like a friendlier version of what happened before. So basically what it does is it covers up any of those contradictions. This is the same thing, like even you can think about like welfare laws are included things like passing labor laws, you know, and you probably like in some high school history class at some point talked about like all the horrible things they did to children working in factories, you know, sort of like Upton Sinclair's like The Jungle, right? People getting their arms taken off in meat packing plants and then sending them out for people to eat anyways. You know, like all those things that sort of protect us, buffer us from just being sort of like ground under, right? Are a version of the welfare state, right? So this is essentially Habermas's theory is that traditionally, right, in his revamping of Marxism, the welfare state sort of took the place of what would be like the revolution, right? So the welfare state becomes the thing that allows capitalism to persist. Okay, now we can get into legitimation, right? Do you guys remember talking about Habermas has different systems that are interacting with each other, 3 different systems in this case? Habermas loves drawing boxes of systems.
Is it the politics, economics, and cultural?
Yeah. So economics, politics, cultural. So essentially what he's saying is that these systems interplay in a specific way. So you need the cultural system, in essence, to support the political system, right? So for political systems to have legitimacy, we have to feel like they work, right? The only thing that allows power to continue to exist, this is like a long truth in sociology, goes all the way back to Weber, right? The only thing that allows power to exist is that we believe in it. Once we cease to believe in it, it falls apart. This even goes back to like, anybody here talk about Plato's Republic in your philosophy class? No? Just Plato's Republic, like, you know, it's like one of the biggest early philosophy, books of philosophy, right? But in it, he talks about this thing called the myth of the metals, right? Society's held together by some sort of noble lie. If people don't believe it, society will fall apart. It's essentially the same idea, right? That legitimacy is necessary for the political system to continue to exist. We also have the economic system. To keep the economic system going, we have to, in essence, have intervention through politics. This has always been true. We're going to talk for the taxation article about Karl Polanyi and the idea of embeddedness. It's always been true that to some degree the market is embedded inside of governments. What's different about the welfare state or Keynesianism is it's like politicians expressly understood that and started to create systems on purpose that did that. So what we have, essentially what we have in the West right now, according to our authors, is something that two crises intertwined that Habermas explains might happen. And one of these is a legitimation crisis, and the other is a rationality crisis. Okay. So the rationality crisis is in essence what happens between economics and politics. So the idea is if we think about when we were talking about the history of like the development of Keynesianism as a philosophy to combat the Great Depression would be an economic crisis, right? The political intervention would be a rationality crisis, right? So rationality crises can absorb economic crises, and then we can just sort of go about our business. But there's one thing that can happen that can break that down, and that's the legitimation crisis. So if the actions of the government in its attempt to bracket or to prop up the economic system loses public support, then we fall into the legitimation crisis, right? We lose a feeling of legitimacy towards our government. So, kind of backing up, we move back to, he tackles this issue a little in the introductions in a very concise way, and I think it's worth kind of backing up and looking at there. So there's two things that, according to our author, so our author is going to apply Habermas to understand this rise in populism. And so if we see where, if you go to page 796, you'll see where this happens. So do you see in the very middle of this paragraph, so he's just introduced the theory of legitimation crisis, what we were just talking about, right? And then in the middle of the paragraph, there's a sentence, both middle vertically and horizontally, there's a sentence that starts, the article's central claim is. You see where I'm at? Do people see where I'm pointing to? No? So, right about there on page 796. Middle of the only, or the first full, or the second full paragraph there. Paragraph starts with pushing the argument further. It's right in the middle. Somebody who has it wanna volunteer to read the last half of this paragraph? Thank you.
The article's central claim is that this legitimation crisis ultimately derives from Western welfare states' effective loss of control over economic life under conditions of economic and financial globalization.
Okay, I'm going to pause. What do you guys think that means? Western welfare states' effective loss of control over economic life under globalization. We talked about globalization before in here, haven't we? In passing. What was globalization? What happens in globalization? Oh, it's been a few weeks. Or you could just search into your computer globalization. Yeah, go ahead.
The process by which businesses or other organizations develop international influence or start operating on international scales.
Yeah. So increasingly, the things that our economy does functions at an international scale. We talked about this in the context, remember when we were talking about commodity chains and like global economies back when we were talking about global inequality, right? Like essentially what that's saying, like what globalization is that, companies no longer, really abide by any geographic territory. So it's really hard to say that like there is an American economy or a British economy or an Azerbaijani economy, right? Like instead there's in a lot of ways one global economy. So what's the problem with that if you're talking about this system, right? So we're talking about the government intervening in the economy to sort of create a buffer. Like, what's the difficulty here? If you're talking about a global economy. Yeah.
I feel like if you're talking about like going global with your economy, that obviously moves past like each specific country's government, so like you kind of lose legitimacy in your government, which can like fall into that crisis.
Yeah. So the government can't control these global crises as well as they could when they were local, right? So in that way, we sort of like lose some of that buffer. So, so it makes this part, right? It makes using, taking the economic crisis and turning it into a rationality crisis, it makes that step a lot more difficult. There's questions about whether you can even do that, right? It makes regulating companies a lot more difficult. And also, like, it makes things like, because they're now global, economic entities are a lot more powerful than they were before. You think like there's a lot of like top 500 companies that have larger gross domestic products than most countries in the world, right? So you think about that, it becomes very difficult, right, to intervene in the economy. So that buffer kind of dies away. This is actually like part of that literature we were talking before about risk, that we're exposed to more risk. You guys remember talking about that in here? That's just kind of the same idea, right? Why are we exposed to more risk? Well, it's partially because there's nothing to regulate anything anymore, right? Things are happening at a very global scale. So that's one thing. One example we see of a legitimation, right? We no longer really feel or trust that the government can do that. We can also claim that to some degree, like, we're uncomfortable with the government regulating and buffering in general. There's sort of this ideological basis that a lot of people feel like that shouldn't happen. To some degree, that delegitimizes the welfare state. We can't get rid of the welfare state. We're embedded enough in it that it's pretty much a permanent thing now, right? So like, you can't undo the systems that we've constructed over the last century and a half, right? And attempts to do so have often been really harmful. So like the welfare state, whether you like it or not, is kind of like here to stay. The question is like, do we legitimate it? Do we keep order and prop up that system, even if we change how we do it, or do we simply like delegitimize it, and in essence in doing so, delegitimize our government, right? So in essence, what our author's saying is what we're falling into is delegitimizing the existing state within the United States of America, as well as delegitimizing, in most countries, people delegitimizing their own states there. Particularly this is true of Europe. So what it wants to claim is what we see is this rising populist sentiment because our state has fallen into this legitimation crisis, right? It fails to properly conduct a rationality crisis, so it becomes a legitimation crisis. It gives another example of that in 2008 with the bank bailouts, that a lot of people felt really upset about that, and it's another like form of populism that we see. But that's in essence like what the argument of the article is. Any questions or thoughts on this, or confusions people have about it that you won't clarify? Because I do want to get to the Kansas tax article. Now, our two articles for this week are somewhat similar. They tackle somewhat similar issues, which is, all of them to some degree this week. Every week in some ways have been similar, right? Because it's on a similar theme. But this one ends up pulling out something very similar. So I'm going to pull us to just to announce what article it is. It's the Alvord article, What Matters in Kansas. And I really just assigned this because it takes place in Kansas, and that's where we're all at. It's not very often that you usually get, because sociology, if you can't tell, it's very globally oriented, right? So it's not very common that you're like, hey, this is about the place I'm living. So I was like, let's just do that. So this is a political sociology article on a specific set of policies that happened in Kansas and how it relates particularly to this theory constructed by somebody named Carl Poliani. So Carl Poliani is an anthropologist who's writing in the 1930s and 40s mostly. But he's really like, he was kind of like this obscure thinker that in the last 15 years people started using a ton. Like, academics are a little fad, like they're kind of like fashionable. And so Carl Poliani is very fashionable right now. So Carl Poliani's basic idea, sometimes referred to as disembedding or the double movement. So Poliani. So Carl Poliani, the idea is usually referred to as disembedding. Two D's, not two E's. Disembedding, or sometimes it's referred to as the double movement. Which the double movement technically isn't Carl Poliani, it's somebody by the name of Fred Bloch. Who is kind of the person who popularized Carl Poliani again. Okay. So Carl Poliani writes a critique of not neoliberalism, but original economic liberalism in the 30s. So in the height of the Great Depression is when he's writing. And so according to Carl Poliani, there's a difficulty in trying to remove the market from culture. And he means culture very broadly because he's an anthropologist. So culture kind of ends up encapsulating everything that we do. So like our political system is a part of our culture, right? So is all the other things we would normally associate with culture, right? Mass media, or if you're a small scale society, art, right? All these things like our religion, right? All these things are culture in anthropology, so they're all broadly referred to as culture. If you remember back to our week on culture. So the idea of Carl Poliani is that there's a difficulty in trying to remove the market, right, from culture. Another way to put that is that economics has always been embedded in culture. So economics has always been embedded in culture. And that's really true, like, so when we talk about, early liberalism was based off of basically conjecture about how early people lived. So has anybody here ever heard of like John Locke, Adam Smith, right? These sort of figures. So if you're in a philosophy class or a political science class, you learn about John Locke. John Locke is going to posit what was things like in the state of nature, right? So in the state of nature, what was life like? Same with like Thomas Hobbes. What was it like for people living in a state of nature, right? Before civilization. What it turns out is that what they assumed would be from sitting around in an armchair thinking about what people lived in before states was pretty much completely wrong. And what I mean by that is like people are, and like our mythos about, and I'm going to put this in scare quotes, right? Primitive people is that they're savages, right? That's not true. In essence, like if we talk about, primitive people, what anthropologists today would call a small-scale society, right? The thing is like they often have very active cultures that regulate their behavior a lot, right? Or things like we have a mythos that basically people went around before states and they just constantly killed each other, where people in small-scale societies are less violent than people in states. You would be less likely to be killed if you lived in some traveling band, right? Some nomadic band or a group of or tribe of people herding cattle. You'd be far less likely to be victimized by other people in your society or people in surrounding similar societies than you are walking down the streets of Atchison, and Atchison's a fairly safe place. And the reason why is because just like everything is sort of embedded in these inner networks of people, this culture. So everything is regulated. So like rather than sort of like, when Adam Smith or John Locke thought about the past, they thought that people were just sort of like exchanging goods like as if they didn't know each other, right? As if they were sort of just wandering the wilderness individually all on their own. But in reality, like all economic relationships have always been embedded inside of these interrelationships between people. What, if we were talking in Marxist language rather than Karl Polanyi language, would be called a relationship of production. So, in small-scale societies, it's usually, most of the people you interact with are from your own family, right? So like, even tribal systems of 300 or 400 people, a lot of times those people are in some ways your relatives or not, right? And essentially what guaranteed how exchanges would happen, exchanges of good, exchanges of money, is the sort of rights and privileges, right, as well as the responsibilities that you have to people within your own familial groups, right? So originally culture was very, if you want to think about it, originally the economy was embedded in the family, right, as an institution. As societies got larger, obviously we don't live in one giant family. So like if we want to think about, and Karl Polanyi would think about the world this way, so he's not one of these people who are going to be like globalization, we don't have national economies. But if we wanted to think about like the economy of the United States, in Karl Polanyi's worldview, the economy of the United States obviously isn't embedded in a family, right? Because we no longer have one giant familial network interconnecting all the millions of people that we live in. But at some point, this familial structure gets replaced by a state structure, right? And so the state structure is what often the economy becomes embedded in historically. And that's a slow process. So the process of coming from that sort of small-scale familial structure to states regulating the economies takes thousands of years, right? So you're talking about like, even if you were to only go back to the Middle Ages, it's kind of being regulated by both, right? Because like the political system is still bound to familial structures, right? Who owns what? Well, and even property, right? Property rights are based upon families. This is no longer true, right? Like property is just sort of bought and sold and exchanged on a market, right? But now it's regulated by the government, right? And if you think about what a contract is, the contract is essentially the government being the guarantor, just like it's some sort of like, just like it was like your grandfather or something, right? Some sort of guarantor that the exchange is going to be held up, right? So no matter what you're talking about is the economy, right? The market is always embedded in culture, right? So for Karl Polanyi, we have a philosophy that the market shouldn't be embedded in culture, that it should be removed from it. But for Polanyi, he thinks that this is a mythology that's not actually achievable. So, and what happens is essentially as we disembed the economy, eventually what's going to happen is fractures in that philosophy. The fact that the economy isn't some thing floating out there in space by itself that you could actually remove becomes really obvious. And then essentially what happens is that people have to, right, in essence, pull back and re-embed the economy in one way or another. This is what he refers to as the double movement. Right? So or what Fred Bloch will later refer to in double movement. So Karl Polanyi's original study, The Great Transformation, covers about 600 years of British history. And essentially what he's doing is he's just tracking all these times that England tried to disembed their economy, and then all the crap that happened from disembedding the economy and the ways in which it was embedded. And then when they started to disembed the economy, and all the things that happened when they disembedded the economy and the ways in which people re-embedded it, right? And showing that there's this weird, like, sort of double movement that occurs across time, right? Okay, so essentially what our author's doing is taking this philosophy by Karl Polanyi and then applying it specifically to something that happened in Kansas not that long ago. Okay, so let's back off. Did anybody catch what happened in Kansas? 2012. Once again, this is very recent history, right? You can actually, if you look around Kansas, you can see the effects of this policy. Yeah?
They basically cut taxes for like smaller businesses.
Well, we'll get into the small businesses is a little bit like true and a little false. We'll see how. But what was the goal of the Kansas government in 2012 to change its tax policy? Does anybody live here at this time? Is there any native Kansas people? Do you remember this? Do you guys remember this at all? They wanted to eliminate all income tax. So the idea is that they would completely do away with income tax altogether. I lived in Tennessee when they tried to do something similar and they tried to get rid of all property taxes. But anyway, so they try to eliminate eventually they're going to eliminate all income tax. They try to start with something that, in essence, they think it's going to be, the claim was, at least on the surface, that it's going to be for small businesses. We'll look at why it ended up not really being for small businesses. Okay. So what's the downside to that? Like, sounds great. Everyone hates paying taxes, right? Like, why do you want, what's the downside to it? What's the downside to lowering taxes in this way? It's pretty massive. There's only one, by the way, there's only one state that doesn't pay income taxes. Anybody know what it is? It's cited in the article. Alaska. Does anybody know why?
Because they got like the oil and stuff like that.
Yeah, essentially the oil companies bring in enough revenue that they don't actually have to give any income taxes to anybody in the country, the state, right? Obviously not the same situation as the one that we see here, right? So what's the idea? They'll cut taxes and then what's going to happen? They may catch this, what they thought would happen if you cut taxes. What is often an argument we have? If you cut taxes, particularly cut taxes for businesses, what's going to happen? What do people think will happen?
They said that they could like reinvest and hire more employees.
Yeah, that essentially what's going to happen is the claim is that if you cut taxes for the upper class, they'll put money back into the society. They'll hire more people, they'll make more investments, et cetera, et cetera. When does that actually end up happening in Kansas when they cut taxes? No, it doesn't, right? And so, and part of what's being pointed out here is that, the small business, the place of small businesses. What do we think of when we think of small businesses? Actually, let's back up. Let's read a quote. I like quotes. Let's take from. I had a note here. Okay, right here. Wait, no, that's not right. Sorry. Whenever I change what I plan on doing, I always end up. End up getting lost. Anyway, okay, so we'll talk, since I can't find the exact quote I was looking for. Does anybody what's the place of small businesses in our minds? What do we think of when we think of small businesses? What is a small business? You hear that word a lot, right? What falls under that?
Like the businesses that aren't a part of like bigger corporations, so like the mom and pop shops that they're doing a lot.
Yeah, what you think of is like the sort of small local businesses that people own, right? So like, you walk down the Atchison, there's restaurants and little stores and stuff like that, and all those are small businesses. So there are people who do a lot of your services. Like you can get a plumber that belongs to a large corporation, or you can kind of just have a local plumber, right, come out and do things, right? All those sort of people is what we often associate with small businesses. Small businesses hold a particular place within American mythology. And what I mean by that is like at one time, small businesses were business, right? In the United States, things were ran by local elites at one time. Particularly through most of the 1800s, things were run by local elites. At one time there were small banks, and like they were generally embedded in the community. Anybody ever see that house with the dragons on it on 6th Street? That was the house still owned by his families, but the person who ran the Atchison Bank, right? So that was the house of this one banker who, right? But that banker, right? And this is true of all small businesses, they're embedded in that community, right? So like thinking about, sort of like Carl Polanyi world, right? Like local businesses, like people are very obviously embedded. Anybody here have any families that own small businesses? Any family members? Or my father is a sign painter. What is?
My uncle has like his own plumbing business.
His own plumbing business. And people who run small businesses, like they're actually often very like, they're almost a little bit obsessed with what the local community thinks about them, right? And so like, there's a certain like limitation to how cutthroat a small businessman can be in their community, because if it gets back to people that they're charging too much, or they're not doing good work, or that they're rude, or that they tromp mud all over your floor when they come into, right? Then essentially what happens is that people, like especially smaller communities, like people have word of mouth, right? And so people are very concerned about that. So they're solidly embedded inside that community, right? So it turns out in terms of taxing, it's very hard to tax or remove taxes, right, from specifically small businesses. That's because small businesses actually don't share a lot in common. There are tons of different ways of running a small business, right? And then but none of them really look the same. And then small businesses, as we define it in the United States, could mean, your uncle's plumbing business. It could mean Till Vodka, which cuts across 3 states because it has less than 2,000 employees, right? So like in some states it's I think in Kansas is actually 500. In some states you can have up to 5,000 employees and be a small business, which is a factory, right? So like small businesses are pretty gradated in what we consider it, right? So in essence, like just to quickly kind of summarize the issue, when they tried to cut taxes, they were going to start with small businesses and move out from there. And the idea is that small business owners would essentially hire more people. But the way in which they did the tax structure, it actually disproportionately helped major corporations in Kansas, particularly the Koch brothers. And so small businesses actually saw a very small gain, but because the government became so defunded, small businesses often lost a lot of like the subtle forms of support that they had. As well as like things were happening in the communities that small businesses didn't like. Things like the schools in Kansas could no longer be open for a full school year because they couldn't afford to keep the schools open. The streets started to degrade. That's one of the reasons why I said you might be able to tell some of the impact of that law still. you know, the streets started to degrade because people couldn't keep them up, right? And all these various things, even within a couple of years, it became very obvious that the state didn't have enough revenue. Because states have to balance their budgets each year. And the idea was that that increase in income would essentially, or that having no taxes would draw businesses in and things like that, which actually never actually occurred. So we never actually built a bigger tax base to make up the difference. So that what they had assumed would happen didn't. And so what happened is so if you want to think about it, like they were attempting to disembed the economy, right? Remove the political system from it. It had negative consequences. And then this is what's really strange about this is then the business owners actually, particularly small business owners, became the people who lobbied to get the tax code changed, right? A population that we usually think of as people who are specifically against taxes. So here you get that double movement happening. So basically Kansas becomes an example of Karapol-Yanni's double movement and what happens when you disembed the economy. Okay, with that said, next, so I'm giving you guys Friday off to work on your term papers, right? And so we'll come back Monday. Monday we'll talk about our first article that discusses the marriage and family section of our course. So the last subtopical area, right, the last subfield we're going to talk about is marriage and the family. Then Wednesday and Friday we have presentations, and then the Monday after we'll finish up marriage and the family, presentations, and then we'll have a week of presentations. And we'll have presentations, like, this is nothing new, just 25 minutes, right? We'll have presentations the last day before Thanksgiving break, and then that'll be it. So, see you all Monday.